listener production.
Hey, it's Antoinette Lattouf with the Weekend Briefing, where we hit pause on the headlines, the pace slows down and the stories get more personal. Today is World Press Freedom Day, and my guest is Peter Greste. If you don't know his name, you probably know his story. In late December 2013, Peter Greste was working as a foreign correspondent. He and two Egyptian Al Jazeera journalists were arrested by Egyptian authorities in Cairo. 6 months later, Greste was found guilty of falsifying news and damaging Egypt's international image. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The Aussie government intervened, negotiating with the new Egyptian regime, and almost 2 years later, Peter was deported back to Australia under the condition that he would face trial or prison at home. But Australia did no such thing. Peter joins me to talk about The Correspondent, the new movie based on his harrowing experience.
Peter Greste, door of prison. The passionate words of a fellow journalist, Peter Greste, Al Jazeera correspondent imprisoned in Cairo.
Australian journalist Peter Greste
And
is vowing
Australian
to continue
journalist Peter
fighting for
Greste
freedom.
has written a public letter
Australian
from
journalist
his jail
has written
cell
of his
in
ordeal in
Cairo.
his cold cell in
The
Toronto.
imprisonment of the Australian journalist and two Al Jazeera colleagues has drove condemnation from human
British
rights
colleagues
groups.
joining calls for the team's immediate release.
From media organisations around the world stand in solidarity.
We also discuss his healing process, the current chilling impact of media suppression in Australia, and the unprecedented and ferocious brutality facing journalists, overwhelmingly Palestinian journalists in Gaza, where more have been killed than in any conflict since records began. And then we change gears later in the show because Helen Smith and I bring you the weekend list, and that's where we recommend what to watch, eat, listen to and do. But first, here's Peter Greste. Peter Greste, welcome to the Weekend Briefing.
Thanks for having me, Antoinette.
So it's Cairo, late December 2013. The streets are tense. There's the post-revolution dust still settling. Do you remember the story you were chasing in those final hours of freedom, the last thread of journalism you were following before everything changed when you got that knock on your hotel room door?
Gosh, it's a good question. I don't remember the precise story at the time. We were covering the unfolding political crisis as it was happening, and each day there were protests in the street. Supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood government that had been ousted in a military coup about 6 months earlier were continuing to demonstrate, and often those would turn quite violent, and the authorities were trying to suppress those demonstrations. And there was an ongoing process of constitutional reform, and so there was a lot of politics and social upheaval at the time, and we were pretty immersed in all of that.
And when the police raided and hauled you and your Al Jazeera colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Baha Mohammed, off to prison, was that the most terrifying moment of your career? Or as a foreign correspondent seasoned in war zones and collapsed regimes and volatile circumstances, did you just initially assume, hey, this is a bureaucratic hiccup and maybe there's just a bit more shouting than usual?
No, I've been detained before. You know how these things go. Sometimes, it's a bit of an occupational hazard when you're working in some of these pretty difficult environments. I genuinely thought that it would disappear fairly quickly. Usually there are a few phone calls, sometimes an apology, sometimes not, and you're either released or, at worst, I thought we'd be escorted to the airport and stuck on the next plane out of the country. I didn't really expect it would turn quite the way that it did. There was no moment that was truly terrifying, but more sort of slow, horrific realisation of just how serious it was, particularly, I think, when we learned the charges that we were facing. There were some pretty serious terrorism charges. There was aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, being members of a terrorist organisation, advocating terrorist ideology, publishing false news with intent to undermine national security, financing terrorism. They're about as serious as you get, short of actually pulling the pin on a grenade.
Do they know how much journalists make? I don't know how they would expect on a journalist's salary that we would finance terrorism. But it was also because you were working for Al Jazeera and it was considered or framed as a terrorist outfit.
Yeah, it was. And that's because the Egyptians had this sort of wider narrative about Qatari support for the Muslim Brotherhood. The government, after ousting the Brotherhood, the military-backed government had started accusing them of being involved in acts of terror. And because Qatar was supporting the Brotherhood, Qatar, by extension, became accused of also supporting terrorism. And because we worked for a Qatari-funded organisation, we were a part of that wider conspiracy. But just to be clear, Antoinette, it was us three that were charged with these offences, and I always felt that, okay, that's fine. If that's what you think, then let's see what your evidence is. Have a look at what we've actually done. Show us the terrorist ideology that we've been advocating. Show us our membership of a terrorist organisation. Follow the money. Show us how we've been financing terrorism.
Yeah.
And in the end, I don't think it was really about Qatari, proving Qatari malfeasance in Egypt. I think that was a politically convenient narrative.
Yes.
If the authorities wanted to show that, then there are plenty of other journalists with far deeper connections that they could have gone after to build a case, a more credible case. It really had nothing to do with the evidence. It was just about sending a message to all journalists that you will not talk to the Brotherhood. You won't publish or broadcast anything that we don't like.
Watching it in the movie, watching that scene when you get a knock on the door, what struck me was that there was a lot less kind of sort of drama and shouting and confrontation than I expected.
Who is it? Mr. Peter? Yes. Who are you? Are you police? It's time to go.
How close to reality was what was portrayed? That
was pretty close to it. There was that knock on the door. I didn't bother checking the peephole. I wasn't too concerned about it. But when I cracked open the door was shoved inside as if there was a powerful spring behind it. And these guys just all marched in and started searching and ransacking the place. And you're right, it wasn't particularly dramatic. It just felt like, they moved with obvious professionalism that said to me that these guys were well trained, they were experienced, they knew what they were doing, and that they were probably official. They were in plain clothes, so it wasn't immediately obvious, but it wasn't the sort of, there wasn't shouting. These guys didn't come in with weapons drawn, yelling at me to get on the floor, all that kind of stuff. It was more of a bureaucratic exercise, I think.
So you find yourself in prison soon after, and you've spoken of losing agency and control during your imprisonment. And how did that psychological erosion manifest day to day? And how did you resist it?
It's funny. Let me deal with the second bit of that question first. In some respects, resisting becomes futile because you can't claim back that agency in the way that you would like. At some point, you actually have to accept the reality of the situation that you've got. Work your agency over the small bits of your life that you can actually control, and usually that's the tiny physical space that you have around you. I was determined to set aside some time for creativity, and we discovered fairly quickly that the food that we were given often came wrapped in aluminium foil, and if you peeled off the foil quite carefully and smeared it and flattened it out, we discovered that if you smeared soap on one side of it, then it quite neatly stuck to the polished concrete walls that we had, and we were making these really big foil murals. And foil has a shiny side and a matte side, and so you could create these really lovely subtle effects. We figured out how to make a backgammon set. The pieces were relatively straightforward. We were getting bottled water sometimes, and some of them had blue caps and some had red caps, and so we were able to make the pieces. And sketching out a board on the floor was reasonably straightforward, but the challenge was the dice. You can't really easily carve a dice, so we realised ultimately that after a lot of thinking that the dice is just a random number generator, and if you scratch the numbers 1 to 6 on some pumpkin seeds and shove them in a cup, then you could pretty easily pick out a couple of seeds and create a dice that way. There was a lot of meditation, a lot of exercise, just things that we would do that would take control over time. take control over our own physical space.
What about at the other end? Crying, hopelessness, despair?
There was a sense of despair, but honestly, Antoinette, I remember, and I think in a lot of ways this was where meditation helped. I went through a fairly difficult breakup some years previously, and to try and steady the ship, I went and did a Vipassana meditation course, which is a fairly hardcore course where you spend 10 days silent meditation, no reading material, no writing material, no communication with anybody else. And you spend all of that time learning to sit with your own mind. And when I went into solitary confinement, even though I don't think I really fully appreciated how Vipassana worked when I did the course, when I finished it, by the time I went into solitary confinement, I realized that actually I had the tools for this. I'd been there before. And
wow.
I realize now that I think was an absolutely crucial part of the whole process of being able to observe your mind. I remember there was one moment when I was really boiling over with anger. I was furious at the assholes that put us in prison. I was furious at the concrete walls and the bars that were confining us. I was furious that I couldn't have the life that I wanted, until one moment in meditation I realized, hang on a tick, what I've done is I'd created this fantasy world, this alternative reality, and I was angry that I wasn't in that reality. I was angry at the bars and walls that had no relationship to me. That wasn't their fault. It was just, they were just there. And the people that I were angry with, the people that put us in prison, they weren't aware of what we were doing or my anger. And so, in that kind of concrete space, the only person that was being harmed by my anger was myself. And I realized it was just ridiculous. And so not that you suppress the anger, but you accept it as a normal human reaction, but you don't get caught up in that thing. And I think that was true of a lot of that emotion. I sort of started to realize this stuff as sort of just mental artifacts and learned, again, just to let it go.
What portion of your days in prison did you spend in solitary confinement?
The first couple of weeks was in solitary confinement, which it turns out is a fairly routine way of processing prisoners, new arrivals. You get stuck in these boxes and they basically leave you to your own devices for at least a couple of weeks. They say it's a sort of it's a medical quarantine, but anybody who's been through that experience would recognise very quickly that it's got nothing to do with medical treatment and everything to do with the psychological pressure.
Peter, you've written 2 memoirs and they've been adapted into a film called The Correspondent. What was it like watching someone portray your most vulnerable and trying moments? And I'm keen to know what actor Richard Roxburgh got right, not just in his performance, but also in his spirit.
An awful lot, to be honest. And like one of the things I was really grateful for when I started working with not just Rox, but the whole team involved in the film, from the scriptwriter Peter Duncan to Creve Stenders, the director, and all of the creatives involved, was a real curiosity how I coped and the psychology of it all. Much as we've just been discussing, there was a real curiosity, a real empathy. Rox really, he wasn't trying to be me. He wasn't trying to impersonate me. I remember I had one day on the set where I asked him if it was a bit weird having me there, and he told me exactly that. And that was a huge relief because it meant I didn't have to worry about seeing any sort of weird quirks of my own character appearing on screen. I think he nailed the emotional intensity of it, the kind of confusion and chaos of our arrest, the claustrophobia of confinement, the frustration and anger of being stuck in that ridiculous Kafkaesque trial, and the really discombobulating moment of my release. It was all there. I think he understood and really was able to inhabit the authenticity of those emotions in ways that I really didn't anticipate.
And speaking to that authenticity, the film avoids cliches because it depicts prison life with quite a bit of emotional nuance. There's laughter and boredom, absurdity. Was this a deliberate correction to typical portrayals of incarceration?
Yeah, I mean, it was part of the conversations that I had with both Peter Duncan and Creve. I was always concerned. I was both concerned and hopeful that they'd get this right, but I was also worried that it wouldn't actually work. Criv said to me that he really loved the fact that the story broke a lot of the prison tropes. It wasn't Midnight Express. I wasn't tortured beyond solitary confinement. I wasn't physically abused. I had some fairly strong relationships with some of the guards. They weren't the kind of classic two-dimensional sadistic villains that you often see portrayed in these kinds of films. And I was really grateful. I was hoping that they'd get that right. I didn't want these guys to be flattened out as evil characters. And Criv seemed very drawn to that idea. We had quite a lot of conversations, but I have to admit, as I said, I was worried that it wouldn't work and that audiences might not accept it. But so far, as you said, it does seem to have been, people seem to recognise and really appreciate that those relationships are much more complicated than they might seem in a lot of other portrayals.
And you had a hands-on role with the scripting. You had a vetting role, as I understand, shaping the story alongside the filmmakers. What were some of the more, let's say, ambitious creative liberties you had to perhaps politely veto? Was there any slow-mo rooftop chases or an unexpected prison love interest that didn't quite pass the fact check?
There was an attempt early on to create a love interest that didn't really quite work. Yes. That kind of got binned fairly quickly. No, I don't think there was a hell of a lot that I had to really put my foot down. It was really much a sort of nudging in the right kind of direction. There were a few things that I was really determined to get right. I mean, you've spoken about the relationships with the guards and others, and that was really important. There was in particular, I think there was the tension between, or the different worldviews between myself and Fahmy. This is one of my two colleagues that were arrested alongside us, and he and I had very, very different worldviews of what was taking place. We had very different understandings of it, and therefore very different strategies about what we thought would be the best way to get us out, and that caused a hell of a lot of tension. And I wanted Fahmy's perspective to be understood. People don't necessarily have to agree with him, but I wanted people to recognise and identify the way that he saw the world as perfectly legitimate. And we had, again, quite a few conversations to make sure that they nailed that.
What's your relationship now like with your two former colleagues who you were imprisoned with?
Oh, it's still pretty good. We're still very much in touch. Bahar is in Washington, D.C. at the moment. Fahmy's is still in Egypt. It's as Fahmy, both Bahar and Fahmy said that, in a way we're a bit like brothers. We've been through this experience. Yeah. We know each other far better. We know our edges and soft spots in more intimate ways than even our parents sometimes do, I think. And so you can't go through that experience without having a close connection to people like that.
Well, let's talk about getting you out, because you were the beneficiary of global advocacy from your Al Jazeera colleagues to Australian journalists and politicians. Many of us were invested in your release and safety. I remember being one of the many journalists who taped my mouth and took a picture and put it on social media. So in Gaza, over 165 journalists have been killed by Israeli forces, and there's a lot of evidence, there's mounting evidence, in fact, of deliberate targeting. And I personally will never forget the footage of journalist Ahmed Mansour burning alive after an Israeli airstrike hit a media tent in Khan Yunis. Given your experience, what you've lived through, what are you doing now to advocate for those journalists in Gaza?
I've been doing quite a lot of writing. I've written a couple of pieces, some op-eds, calling out the unprecedented murder of journalists in Gaza. The attack on what I see is a very explicit attack on press freedom, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank by the Israeli authorities, a government that insists it is the only only democracy in the Middle East. It's hard to see that when we're seeing those kinds of attacks on press freedom. I've also set up closer to home an organisation, an advocacy group called the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, and we do a lot of advocacy for media freedom issues, both here in Australia and also across the Asia-Pacific region, which is pretty well underrepresented, I think, in terms of media freedom groups. And we are seeing attacks on media freedom really, really spreading in ways that I'm finding quite alarming. I suspect you do too.
What ways are you referring to?
Well, we're seeing the numbers of journalists being murdered at record highs. This is according to statistics from the Committee to Protect Journalists. And the CPJ we know counts these numbers very, very conservatively.
Yes. Yes.
We're also seeing, according to the CPJ, record numbers of journalists imprisoned for their work. One other statistic which I think is particularly alarming is the way in which the CPJ has assessed the charges that those imprisoned journalists are facing. And between 2/3, close to 3/4 of them are there on what the organisation calls anti-state charges. So that's things like treason, sedition, threats to national security, and, of course, terrorism. And I think that talks to the way in which governments have started approaching journalism that challenges them. They see it as a security threat, not as a problem of defamation or of fact-checking, but as a threat to national security. And I think that is a very, very serious way of tackling it, and it speaks to the way in which journalism is under unprecedented attack.
You also signed a petition alongside around 200 Australian journalists, and disclosure, I too signed it, where we were condemning, Israeli attacks on media in Gaza, but also imploring Australian newsrooms to reconsider the way in which they covered the ongoing violence. As a result, many of those who signed that petition were either quietly punished, some were openly punished by their newsrooms by being banned from reporting on Gaza. What does that reveal about the state of press freedom in Australia when it comes to fairly reporting on Gaza, or using their journalistic tools as they would to criticise a foreign government as we would any other foreign government?
For my money, I think there is a problem in Australia where we seem to have a lack of internal debate within the media industry about how to tackle some of these issues, to look really seriously at the reporting and try and recognise when, as an industry, we seem to be going off the rails. And I think, criticising those journalists that were calling out or calling for a more balanced, more nuanced way of covering the crisis, I think came from a place of a lack of self-reflection, a lack of recognition that actually there are better ways that the media can and should be reporting on that crisis. And I think we see that in all sorts of areas where we just don't have the space as an organisation, or as an industry rather, to really talk about, debate and reflect on these issues without it becoming a part of the culture wars. And I think that's really disappointing to see the way that it did become such a crisis.
The other side of the coin is that there are a bunch of journalists in senior roles who have been on paid trips to Israel, and predominantly paid for by the Israeli government. And I'm not suggesting that just because you've been on a junket means you can't do your job as a journalist. But what do you make of the difference in treatment of those who've signed a petition for fairer, more nuanced coverage of Gaza to those who go on these junkets and in many organisations leading the coverage, or at least writing regular opinion pieces?
Yeah, look, I think, as I said, the journalists that signed that petition were simply calling for a more nuanced, balanced, historically relevant way of reporting on the story, placing all of the issues because if you don't know the story, if you haven't been paying attention, then it's very easy to focus on the day-to-day assaults, on attacks and so on, and flatten it out into something that began on October 6th, for example, whereas a lot of people who have been more involved in the story, a lot of other journalists have taken a much deeper, more considered way of placing the story in context. And I don't think there's anything wrong with calling for that. Invariably, that kind of reporting suggested that actually Israel had more of a responsibility for what was taking place in Gaza than the Israelis were acknowledging. And I think by putting journalists on paid junkets, inevitably you're going to be skewing the coverage in a way that's favourable to the Israelis. Again, I agree with you that we don't necessarily want to charge anybody with bias as a result of those kinds of trips. Simply, what we're simply doing, what that letter was simply appealing for, was the kind of reporting that understood what is taking place in Gaza with a lot more historical depth. As a foreign correspondent in Africa, I got incredibly frustrated with the parachutists who would come in and consistently report things as if they were tribal disputes. Anybody who really knew and understood the culture and the politics of those places would very quickly recognise that they had much more deeper, much more complicated origins, and simply dismissing it in those kinds of cliche platitudes didn't help anybody. And I think the same is true of that crisis in the Middle East.
What I've witnessed, particularly over the past 16 or so months, is a lot of people that I know who aren't necessarily news hounds, who don't work in the industry, but turning to Al Jazeera more and more, Middle East Eye, and being unsatisfied with the coverage offered by Australian outlets. I mean, what does that say, or what should that say to Australian outlets?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that people do see a much more nuanced, much more balanced, much more reflective coverage on places like, as you say, like Al Jazeera and other organisations that are more deeply embedded in the region, precisely for the reasons we've just been discussing, that they have they get those regions because they live it in ways that news organisations here often don't. And I think that's also because, frankly, a lot of the news organisations here are winding back on their investment in foreign news. It's not just in the Middle East, it's all over the globe. We're losing foreign correspondents, we're losing those bureaus. Now, I understand why. It's expensive and difficult reporting to do, but it is a part of the social responsibility that news organisations have an obligation to fulfil.
You've said public pressure was key to your release. So why has global public pressure not worked for the journalists in Gaza? Is it the scale of the violence or the silence of Western governments? I think what's to blame?
I think the sad fact is, well, there are two. First of all, it's easy to dismiss the work of the Gazan journalists because they are Palestinian. They're not taken as credible. They're seen as, because they live in Gaza, because they operate in Gaza, the assumption is that they must have some sort of sympathy with Hamas, or worse, they could well be members of Hamas. And so that ambiguity makes it very difficult for people to support them. I also know, and I find this very difficult to acknowledge, but the fact is that one of the reasons I am here and not still in prison in Egypt is because I just had the dumb luck to be called Peter and not Muhammad. I think that if I had been brown-skinned, if I had been Egyptian or from the Middle East, we wouldn't have had anywhere near the kind of public outrage that we did. And that's, partly also because of the incredible empathetic way that my parents expressed themselves in their news conferences. But again, I think that's also because they happen to be, white middle-class Australians. That's unfortunate, but I think it is a reality.
Well, since Israel launched its war, not a single independent journalist has had access to Gaza. And as a former foreign correspondent, what does this tell you about the government's commitment to democracy, as you mentioned earlier, transparency and accountability?
Oh, it sounds to me that the Israelis are trying to control the narrative. It's countless news organisations have applied for access to Gaza. The Israelis have said that's because they've refused it because they've said they can't guarantee the safety of those journalists. But the journalists are grown-ups, they know and understand how to operate. They know the risks that they're taking, and they should be allowed to go if that's what they want to do. I think it is simply because the Israelis are very, very keen to make sure that they control the message. They don't want foreign journalists reporting what's been taking place in Gaza. I think that's pretty clear.
Is it fair to say, though, that the Israelis have had more success in the past or in past decades of controlling that narrative, but are losing that narrative control because of social media and because of Palestinian journalists on the ground?
First of all, let's acknowledge the incredible work that the Palestinian journalists have been doing. They've been doing it despite being killed at an astonishing rate. 10% of their numbers have died in the conflict so far, which is truly staggering. But equally, as you said, social media, I think, has helped deliver a lot of the messages. Of course, a lot of it has been dismissed as propaganda, but the sheer volume of images and narratives that have been flowing out of Gaza makes it very, very difficult to deny the scale of the suffering. And you're right, I think that it has been very difficult for the Israeli authorities to continue to push the narrative that all they're doing is trying to suppress Hamas.
So in 2025, the state of press freedom is less than ideal, whether that is Palestinian journalists being killed in unprecedented numbers, Trump's attack on the media in the United States, the World Press Index showing worrying trends, and that the very people who should guarantee press freedom are suppressing it, and that's political authorities. What's your message then to aspiring journalists? Like, what's the draw card to an industry that feels in so many ways is under assault?
You're asking two different questions. The draw card is a hard one to sort of understand. But what I often say to journalists, to students, is that, listen, ever since a caveman documented the bison hunt on the walls of a cave for posterity, we've needed people to record and document and the events that have been taking place around us and make sense of it all. And we always will need those people. It's just that we are, I think, in a state of flux. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to unfold in future, but I have absolutely no doubt that we will always need good journalists to play that role. But equally, I think the state of the world's media, the flood of fake news, of misinformation online, disinformation, the assault on journalism all speaks to the urgent need to be doing it and doing it well and doing it to a high ethical and professional standard. It means we should be doing more journalism, more good journalism, not less. That doesn't make it easy, it doesn't make it safe, but it is important.
Peter Greste, that's a great place to finish it.
Thank you very much for having me, Antoinette.
Peter Greste, you can check out his movie The Correspondent at a cinema near you. And it's worth noting that Greste's gripping story was, as mentioned, originally published as a memoir called The First Casualty. It's now been reprinted, bearing the same name as the movie, The Correspondent. It's your favourite time of the week. It's the Weekend List, and that's where Helen Smith and we share all of our tips on what to read, watch, listen to, cook, see, do, and everything in between. Helen, I'm always itching to hear what you've been doing with your spare time.
Well, my first recommendation is a movie.
Okay.
It is The Accountant 2. So it's the second film, I guess, of this film. Now, look, I'm going to be frank, it's not as good as The Accountant, the original. So what it is, it's starring Ben Affleck.
Okay.
J-Lo, that's the only connection I have with him these days. Bennifer.
Yes.
So Ben Affleck is the star, and I'll give you a little bit of background because this is important for it. So pretty much the first film sets him all up as his character.
As an accountant?
Yes.
Okay.
An accountant, as you think. So he's a very gifted child, very smart. It shows his whole childhood. He's on the spectrum, like very much on the spectrum. His mother wants to send him to a treatment centre, but his father, who is a military ops, like very, masculine military, very like treats everything with aggression and power, was like, no. And his mother actually ends up leaving the family. So it's this guy, Ben, as a child, and his younger brother. And we see their relationship form. So his father trains him and his younger brother in martial arts and almost trains them as though they're in the military. And they're both very smart kids. And you fast forward a little bit further, Ben is an accountant, a forensic accountant. He's very, very smart, incredibly high up, and still has all of his quirks and everything. Ben Affleck portrays them in a really, really good way. His acting is very good in both of these films. And you later find out he is working with secret agents. He works with bad people and good people. He was working for this company, finds out there's like $60 million or something embezzled in the account, blah, blah, blah. That's when you learn about him in the first film, The Accountant.
Okay, so he's a money launderer?
Low key, he's like not great.
Okay. Okay.
He's working with it's tricky because you want to love him, but then you're like, dude, you're working with criminals right now.
Okay.
But he's such a lovable character. I don't know.
Okay.
And then the second film is the one I just saw. It just came out recently.
Yeah.
It really shows the bromance between Ben and his younger brother, who is also this kind of like bad guy, like super cool action, like somehow they just can use every single gun under the sun. Like, it's wild. Like, who is training these people? Like, what is going on? But
I wish my accountant knew how to use a gun.
Oh my God. I'm like, damn, like these are some pretty cool accountants, but they're not really, they're not really accountants. This one has a lot of bromance in the film. The action is amazing. If you love an action film, The Accountant 2 is definitely like, my mum's going to love this film. Okay. She loves it. But I just think the first movie had a bit more substance to it, a little bit more plot. The second one, throughout it, I won't spoil it, but they kind of, you were like, hang on, it's still going? Like, they're still after this one person, or now do you want to help this person or do you want to kill this person? Like, the plot kind of gets a bit lost, but I don't think that's why people go to watch The Accountant. Like, it's action, it's fun, it's got hot people in it, it's a vibe, but hey, go watch it. Not as good as the first one.
Okay, I like that recommendation with a caveat. My first recommendation is a book. I devoured this book in 2 days. I was on holidays last week. It's by David Nicholls and it's called You Are Here. So it's fiction. If David Nicholls sounds familiar, it's because he's best known for One Day. That's the heart-wrenching love story that sold millions of copies and is now like a Netflix global hit. There have been two movie makes of it. And he's back with a brand new novel. It is not a sappy romance because I don't love romances. His book is witty, clever, lots of dry humour. It follows two lonely, introverted souls in their 40s, both post-divorce. And they need to be nudged out of their comfort zones, and a mutual friend ropes them into a coast-to-coast walk across England. And so obviously you get a physical journey, lots about the terrain, but it's super funny, emotionally rich, not necessarily a happy ending. I think it's for, it mirrors reality in that people can be quite jaded and broken and lacking direction at that point in their life. Yeah. What I really liked about it is it's authentic. It actually made me laugh out loud quite a few times. It's a crowd pleaser. Like, it's not particularly highbrow, but it was super easy to read. And it also made me want to go for a very long walk. So I recommend You Are Here by David Nicholls for a really easy, funny, well-written read.
I like that too, with the characters also being, a bit older. Like, we're not focusing on like that love or romance in your early 20s or your 30s or whatever. It's actually like focusing on, hey, there's a life after your 40s, and also that romance and I think divorce and I think all of those aspects of life.
Which are more and more common.
So common. It's almost inevitable, right? Yeah. And I think like those aspects generally get pushed to the side a lot when we're talking about love or we're talking about life, because they're the ugly, gross bits. And it's like, well, no, it's wild, like high percentage of marriages end, or your spouse, might pass away, or like circumstances change, and it's like.
And that's what I like about this book, because it doesn't have the beautiful ending. It is, there's a lot of baggage in it. There's a big journey, the
People
walk.
have baggage.
Yes. So anyway, it's a
like
good read.
I really like that. Well, my next one is lowbrow as hell, and it's my favorite thing. Obviously, I love Real Housewives. This one, Real Housewives of New York, I've recently just gotten back into it. I went back to it when Bethany Frankel, she is one of the main OG New York Real Housewives. She's left. Now, recently, they've actually done a whole rehaul of the Real Housewives of New York. They have a completely new cast. So if you want to jump back in, I think start around season 12 and look, it's just crazy. It's fun. It's light. It's not serious. But I have been watching this, and the amount of alcohol that these women drink is quite concerning. Like, it's really brought it back to light. I'm like, damn, they're getting...
The amount of Real Housewives you watch is also quite concerning.
It is quite concerning. But we love Real Housewives.
You know what? I don't. It's something I don't watch. And I was at an event recently and there was a Real Housewife of Sydney there.
Oh, I haven't watched this one. The new one? Yeah.
I think it's the new one. Anyway, she was really lovely, whatever. We were sitting on the same table. We took a photo afterwards. And then I tagged her in my caption. I was like, and at this event were, CEOs and doctors and leaders and of all stripes and even a desperate housewife.
Antoinette.
No, but I didn't mean that.
is she going to know that?
I met Real Housewives. And then she in the comments was like, haha, babe, lovely to meet you. It's Real Housewife, not Desperate Housewives.
Oh,
I was thinking
my
of the
God.
Wisteria Lane.
Yes, this is the show.
Which I loved.
Yeah,
I did watch
I
Desperate
love that too.
Housewives, and I love Eva Longoria, and it wasn't, and I was just like, oh my God. She's like, and then she DM'd me. She's like, and you said that to me in person as well. And I was like,
Antoinette.
I know.
Antoinette. But you got to remember, like Real Housewives, it's reality TV. It's just light. It's crap. But it's for me, it's a wind down from working in the news. Yeah. And I think it's just nothing. Like their issues, their issues that they complain about is nothing. I love their issues because I'm like, I wish they were my issues. Like they just are so out of the world, out of this world. They're in their own circle. Yeah. And I think sometimes that's just refreshing to have a bunch of white women screaming in the background while I'm cooking my dinner is just really therapeutic.
Look, this is a safe space. There's no judgment here, but also there is quite a bit of judgment.
I know. I'll take it.
Okay. Well, my final recommendation, I love physicality and trying new things. And lately I've been enjoying paddleboarding.
Oh.
Okay, so I've moved on from my trampolining. I do still do some of my home trampolining. What I like about it is it's calming, it's outdoors. You can hire a paddleboard for about $30 an hour if you want to buy one because you're going to do it a few times. You could have one for about $200. You can pretty much do it in heaps of waters as long as it's relatively calm. So lakes, rivers, bays, reserves, of which there are plenty around Australia. Good for your core, gentle exercise, but you can burn quite a few calories. So because it's quite it's actually quite hard.
It's quite hard.
It looks harder
you're balancing on a bloody board.
So you're using your stabilizing muscles in your legs, which are often not activated. Yeah, and your core and your arms to row. And so I was in a really terrible mood the other day, and I went out and I went paddleboarding, and I just felt better being in the sun, being outdoors. Got my heart rate up. Tighten my core.
You did all the things. Well, working out is good for your mood. Any kind of workout is builds your...
Yes, it didn't feel like a workout though. It felt
fun.
It felt like a leisurely...
Like your trampolining. Like fun workout. You're tricking yourself to work out.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
And so I'm up to trying everything and anything.
Oh my God.
And paddleboarding is my latest.
I do like paddleboarding, but I fall off all the time. So yeah, I'm not that good. Not like you, Ant.
Okay. I mean, I was meant to say something nice back to you.
I know, you're like, can't all be good at paddleboarding. Okay. I felt that awkward silence.
I did say this is a safe space, no judgment, but also lots of judgment.
Judging me across the table.
Okay, that is it for this very humble episode of the Weekend Briefing. Thanks so much for joining us. It is always a pleasure keeping you company. If you haven't already subscribed, please do download wherever you get your podcast from. And we're always keen to hear your feedback. I would love to know your thoughts on Peter Greste or whether I am right to judge Helen for watching Real Housewives, Desperate Housewives, whatever it's called, all the time. And keen for your tips on what to watch, see, eat and do. We always love hearing what you're listening to. We need inspiration as well. So hit us up on Instagram, DM us some ideas and we'll check them out. But that is it from me for this week. Stay safe, everyone. The team will be back on Monday with the headlines and a fascinating deep dive straight into your headphones.
Listener.